Bullfrog. What do you think of the population control question to Bernie? Because CNN's replies are filled with gross insinuations that Bernie supports ideas like a China's one-child policy or even Nazi experiments. I did not see that.
This is the one the right wing is running with. I'll pull it up here in a second.
Okay.
Just YouTube here.
So I would say sight unseen that I am extremely confident that CNN let a gross, weird question get through their system. There's actually a serious point to be made about this. All right, oh, Jesus. I mean, if Steve Scalise is promoting it, then you know that you don't need to trust
David Duke without the
baggage in his own words.
Human population growth has more than doubled in the past 50 years. The planet cannot sustain this growth. I realize this is a poisonous topic for politicians, but it's crucial to face. Empowering women and educating everyone on the need to curb population growth seems a reasonable campaign to enact. Would you be courageous enough to discuss this issue and make it a key feature of a plan to address climate catastrophe?
Well, Martha, the answer is yes. And the answer has everything to do with the fact that women in the United States of America, by the way, have a right to control their own bodies and make reproductive decisions. And the Mexico City Agreement, which denies American aid to those organizations around the world that allow women to have abortions or even get involved in birth control, to me is totally absurd. So I think, especially in poor countries around the world, where women do not necessarily want to have large numbers of babies, and where they can have the opportunity through birth control to control the number of kids they have, something I very, very strongly support.
Okay, so this is really clear what's going on. So one, we can dismiss the Scalise, all the nonsense about Bernie supporting a one-child policy. That's Alex Jones stuff. But I'll take the two serious parts of this. He heard that question as a question about reproductive justice and birth control, and he's right. The insinuations of that question, and I don't know where that woman's coming from, maybe I'm being unfair to her, but the insinuations of that question are very sinister. And I remember there was somebody who was IMing the show that was trying to get me to get obsessed with population rates. And my answer continues to be 100% no. One, because it's a disastrous way of framing it. And the reality is that we all know that if you put in place programs that Bernie's talking about, which we all support, birth control, decision-making about a woman's own body, poverty reduction, healthcare, all of these types of things, that does reduce population growth if you're worried about that. But the broader point here, and something that I was actually just talking with Liz Franzek about on my show, you have to question the relentless obsession in Western academia and Western NGO sector with the population growth of profoundly poor societies. And I mean, this goes back to the 1970s counter critiques from places like The Ecologist magazine and indigenous rights organizations. Why is the Gates Foundation so concerned about a population growth in Malawi? I mean, look, again, I've already taken a sincere concern about public health and women's rights off the table. That's fine. And that was what Bernie thought he was responding to. But if you're talking about simply population growth, it's absurd. I mean, these places where people have this obsessive focus, you're talking about individual average greenhouse gas contributions and climate impact, a fraction of the individual impact of people in the United States. It's absurd. And then blowing it up even broader and thinking of it in an actually intelligent way, these things are not about individual consumption. They are about structural questions. They are about capitalism. They are about the limits to growth. They are not about an individual footprint. This is Vox, and this is a very odd exchange with Bill Gates and Ezra Klein on global progress. Oh, there's no video. Basically, progress in the fight against poverty may be about to stall. Why? The poorest parts of the world are growing faster than anywhere else, especially in Africa. Listen to Bill Gates and Ezra Klein discuss global progress in 2018. Poverty is not a natural phenomenon in Africa or anywhere. Yes, there's ecological factors. Maybe a place has a drought. Maybe a commodity price gets hit. Sure. But the reality,
Africa has natural resources.
Africa has a ton of natural resources. You're talking about a place that I apologize to people who don't like history, never got compensated for being systemically robbed and destroyed for hundreds of years. And this applies across the colonial map. And in a lot of African, so you have systemic theft. Then in the modern iteration, you still have trade agreements that are profoundly unfavorable, as well as U.S. and otherwise backed kleptocracies. And then if you want to pull up the example of like, oh, well, how come Singapore? Singapore was colonized. Well, Singapore is a tiny island nation state that exercised a narrow advantage in the global marketplace. And still, by the way, is simply like places like Hong Kong, Dubai, and Singapore. Poor people just don't exist in a structural way in these places. And to the extent they do, and they do, they're in really bad positions, whether they're getting priced out of a housing market, or there's insufficient services in a place like Hong Kong, or in a place like Dubai. Yes, there's a small group of Emiratis who incidentally have a socialized system in the sense that they get property, they get healthcare, they have incredible benefits. And then the rest of the system is running on feudalism, on literal indentured servitude. I mean, this is as well as, I'll just say liquid capital will be the way I'll euphemistically put it. So if Bill Gates was interested in dealing with African poverty, he would demand complete debt relief, and he would suggest that we have some type of global investment fund to support ecological preservation, infrastructure, and empowering African movements and institutions. That would be a genuine interest. How you could look at a whole systems problem and get focused down to the rate of birth in a country that has barely any ecological footprint to begin with is, to put it mildly, going to the wrong source of focus. And to put it less mildly, is a very, very disturbing, fucked up point of focus, which should make people go back to some of our most darkest times in history. And I'll specifically read up on the history of eugenics. And I'm not saying that that's the intention. I'm saying that that is the intellectual infrastructure that people might not even know they'd be enacting. And even in order to even have such a ludicrous question about how places that have been colonized and then subjected to World Bank and IMF austerity programs, which would not allow them to do the type of public investment that allowed a place like China to grow, and a variety of other geopolitical questions and factors, to go down to the rate of, well, they haven't sort of opened their markets up enough yet. Actually, some places have. Kenya has been growing really fast, and there is some poverty reduction. There's some not poverty reduction because the questions are systemic, is my point. That type of thing really irritates me. And that's a very, Bernie's answer to that is totally fine. I think, though, that he didn't, and a lot of people wouldn't catch the darker implications of what she was saying. There's a really disturbing implication there. And then, yes, is Bernie suggesting a one-child policy? No. We can move on from the nonsense.
Yeah, Margaret Sanger's eugenics aren't exactly helpful for the abortion thing in 2019.
Most profoundly not. And, right. Exactly. I mean, that's a good example of sort of when some right-wing conspiracy theorist brings that up, are they doing it in a disingenuous, reactionary way? Absolutely. And is it also true and not particularly helpful for putting across a serious vision of integrated reproductive justice that deals with structural racism and colonialism? Yeah, it's not. Focus on better models and a better thought process.